just exposing people to one uncivil comment in a newspaper article in a small kind of online experiment increases the probability that they will say something trolly or uncivil by quite a lot. So it really does seem to be, yeah, we just need reminders about what the purpose is.
Very excited to be here with Chris and Lindsay to talk about this topic. So we're talking about social media and knowledge production. We talk, so my co-author and I, so John Vilsner and I talk about social media a little bit in, well, not a little bit, we talk about it in Unassailable Ideas. And the perspective there is really that social media has these indirect and direct effects on sort of on holding these, well, in the book we talk about these beliefs in place, but I'm wondering sort of the direct and indirect effects that we talk about. The direct effects are really sort of the pressure from a social media, what people call social media mobs, and then the indirect effects are sort of the role that social media plays in propping up a particular culture, a particular way of thinking. And so I don't know, I'm just putting that out there. Maybe it's something we'll circle back to, but I want to start us off with one kind of general question, which is, Chris or Lindsay, would either of you like to share any significant experiences you've had on social media and say something about how those experiences shaped your perspectives on engaging on those platforms?
Sure, I can go. I don't know if it's significant necessarily, but I think it was. It was enlightening to engage in. So I posted something a few weeks ago on Twitter. It doesn't really matter what it was, but I put a link to the wrong thing. I made a mistake, in other words, in a discussion around media bias and media effects. And people were very quick to jump on it and say, you're wrong, this is why you're wrong. And I was kind of surprised by the massive response. And I checked it out and I tweeted back and I said, you know what, you're right. I didn't look at the whole study. So thanks for the heads up. And then the conversation was just quiet. And I just thought, is this indicative of how these conversations are going to go? It's like, it's only there to emit outrage rather than engage in an actual conversation.
It's a good question. Maybe we'll answer that here. Chris, what do you think? Oh, you're muted, Chris.
I've certainly had similar experiences, but I'm overall pretty boring on social media. So I'd love to share some data from some of the research I've recently been doing, which was looking at how young people become polarized on social media. And one of the people we encountered in our research was a woman who I call Sarah. That's not a real name, but it's a pseudonym to protect her identity. And I think she was probably like some of the people on this call, very thoughtful young person. She leans to the right, but she went to a Ivy League school and reads the New York Times, the New Yorker, has is pretty sympathetic to both sides and has an interesting biography. She's half Puerto Rican, half Jewish. She's from New York City. And I was kind of, interested in talking to her a lot about her views on race and policing, one of the things that, we've been so polarized about recently. And, I discovered she had really nuanced views. Her father was a police officer, so she kind of saw the, police side of things. She was herself a minority who had kind of experienced some of these other issues and really had what I think are very valuable views. And in the context of a very polarized national debate. And the real tragedy is that, she told us, my research staff and I, when we were interviewing her for our study, I will never talk about any of this online. And, we began to ask her, so, tell us why. I mean, this is a typical story, but tell us why. And she says, well, let me tell you about the last time I tried to talk about politics online. She says, the National Rifle Association had been posting something about, Americans' rights to own guns, pretty innocuous kind of message in the landscape of America's gun control debate. And, she saw that the message was getting kind of a lot of negative feedback from a lot of primarily liberal commentators. And so she just kind of chimed in to say, hey, look, my husband and I own a gun. We go to a gun range to practice, what she thought was a fairly, innocuous comment. And then she tells us, minutes later, people had scrolled through her timeline and discovered that she had kids and said, we hope your kids find your gun and shoot you. And, when we step back into the broader national context, and I'll bet both of you have heard, stories like this too in your research, right? This is all too common. In fact, I think the Pew Research Foundation recently released a report that said the number one reason people are harassed online is for expressing their political views. So I think this problem is pervasive and really goes in and outside academia, but certainly is manifest in academia and among faculty as well.
I'm curious, Chris, in your research, I'm going off script here, but in your research, did you find sort of any symmetry in terms of which side of the political spectrum it comes from or is targeted, or is it asymmetrical or largely symmetrical, or what did you find?
I really think it depends on the issue, but certainly in our research, we found analogs on or kind of examples on both sides. Right. Certainly issue by issue, things are more polarized from one side or another, but we did see, in addition to liberals harassing Republicans, we saw plenty of the other way around, Republicans or conservatives harassing liberals. Yeah.
That's actually kind of interesting that it's issue by that. In other words, it's not the same set of issues that everybody gets fired up about. It's sort of this, I don't know. That's kind of interesting too.
I think a lot of times it's not even really rooted in partisanship. I interviewed a few years ago, if you guys remember Gamergate, I interviewed Brianna Wu a few years ago, who just described the litany of threats that she got and the actual getting swatted and getting doxxed. So having her personal information spread, having the SWAT team come to her house over and over to the point where she and her husband had to leave their home. And this was about video games. It was about representation of women in video games. So I think that there's something about social media that sort of permits people or gives the perception that people can be more threatening. And I think that it's really scary.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it seems like there's a whole separate question about what brings that out in people. And I know in the book, in Unassailable Ideas, one of the things we talk about is this, I cannot remember the name of the author, but this whatever he calls it, the online disinhibition effect. Correct me or tell me the name. I can't remember the name. I don't remember the name of the author off the top of my head, but sort of he goes through this whole line of the outline, sort of all these different reasons why people sort of behave, at least in his theory and his framework, why people behave the way they do online in terms of, obviously the anonymity is a huge part of it, but also just the asynchrony in the responses, the sort of flattening effect. I mean, this is all stuff that he goes into, but anyway, it's an interesting question. So here's a question. In what ways do you think that social media either facilitates or hinders, so going with the fall theme for Heterodox Academy, either facilitates or hinders knowledge production?
If I can jump in. I actually have an example from this week at my university. There was an incident of sexual assault on our campus. And I had a whole conversation with my students in class about it today because the university was relatively slow to respond with an official statement. So students were learning about it on Instagram and on social media before it was through other news sources, before it was even talked about publicly by the university. And I had a conversation with them about, so I'm kind of getting around to the knowledge thing, whereas that they learned about something important that happened to the university through social media, not through official venues. And one thing I learned from them today is that younger people are sort of anticipating and requiring immediate responses to things like this. We had a similar instance a couple of weeks ago. We had a group on campus that was holding up misogynist and homophobic signs, transphobic signs. And our students were sort of, a lot of our younger students were really angry, like that, why isn't the university protecting us? So I'm not happy about these two events happening, but I'm kind of excited because next week is Free Speech Week, and we're going to have several speakers talking about, including Alana, talking about these issues. So be prepared to answer those questions, Alana.
Oh God, okay.
But I think that some of our younger students who really haven't been on campus. They might have ended their high school years online, and now they're experiencing a campus environment that seems threatening to them, but is also, this is what a college campus looks like. I mean, most students are aware that this comes with the territory. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of interesting in terms of not knowledge production in terms of research, but just how students are learning about things happening on campus outside of official messaging.
Well, it's also interesting, the expectation and the demands that it then sets them up to make on the administrator, like it just changes the whole dynamic. It's in an interesting way.
Yeah, they responded within 24 hours, and that was not soon enough for the students.
Right. 24 minutes would be expected. Chris,
yeah, I certainly see some positives. I mean, I remember way back in the early days of social media, a lot of us were optimistic. It seems like romantic now to think about that, especially after the Facebook files this week and many other recent developments. But there's some good data on this too, at least inside academia. One study in particular showed that randomly assigning people to learn how to use Twitter, academics or faculty, boosted their citation rates several years later. Another study showed that when people with a large follower account, that's an important caveat, were asked to retweet articles in a treatment and control condition, where in the control condition they weren't retweeted, they saw about 4 to 6 times more citations. So in its kind of best form, social media does seem to be able to increase the reach of people. Whether it's only among those who have that kind of elite following is a really important question, though.
Well, I think getting at the perils. We talked about this a little bit in our first conversation around these issues. Is if people are rewarded, if professors and faculty and researchers are rewarded by sharing information through Twitter, are we at risk of sort of an agenda setting effect of what researchers are actually studying? So particularly younger scholars who are coming up, are they going to avoid studying some of the classics or some of the pinnacles of theory that really still need to be addressed in favor of the new sexy topic that everyone's tweeting about? So I think that's definitely one possible negative.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, I had a question about some of the study that you just referred to, and I see you put the link in the chat for whoever wants to go follow it up. But I want to just come back to the first point that you said about the teaching them to be on, you're gonna have to correct me, but teaching them to be randomly teaching faculty or administrators to be on Twitter. And what was the conclusion? It had what effect?
It had a positive effect. It tended to increase their citations several years later. Yeah.
So am I reading into this, or is the argument essentially that there's just an effect on the extensive margin, just that by being on Twitter, like it doesn't even, there's something about being on Twitter that increases your, or was it like, well, how did that work? I'm just trying to make sense of it.
It may be, although the second study I was describing, which is one I just linked in the chat if folks are interested in checking it out, it does show that randomly tweeting about articles also improves their citation rates by about 4 to 6 times about 1 to 2 years out. So these are small studies and preliminary studies, but it does seem like there's some positives there.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is interesting. So do you think, so I'm going to move on to another question here. Do you think that academic status, so whether somebody has a tenure line position or is in a non-tenure track position, whatever, that can take a lot of different forms, differently enables scholars to be active on social media?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that just from my own personal experience, there are a lot of things that I am engaging in that I may have been afraid to do so before I got tenure. Mm-hmm. And I think that we need to worry about that because, again, we have these younger scholars coming in and, we have a changing university structure where we're seeing more faculty moving into administrative positions and more adjunct and non-tenure track professionals moving into those teaching positions. So that puts them at in a really risky spot. It wasn't that long ago, I think it was 2015, when that communication professor at, I'm forgetting the university, she was on the tenure track, but she did not yet have tenure. There was a Black Lives Matter group meeting, and she said, you'll probably remember when I say what she said. She said, "Can I get some muscle over here?" to help.
This is at Missouri.
Missouri, that's right.
2014. Yeah.
So, and she was, she was let go. And so I think we have to be very concerned about those faculty that are much more vulnerable. And I think that as tenured faculty, we need to be first in line to come out and speak about, for on my campus right now, about sexual assault, about free speech, and about issues that our students care about. That's more from a kind of a university structural perspective, but from an academic perspective, I think that, again, there are a lot of reasons that younger faculty would be hesitant to tweet about their findings if perhaps they are negative about a certain group of people, conservatives or liberals. I've been privy to some colleagues' studies who looked at the negative effects of watching Fox News, who was on the receiving end of a lot of negative attention. That was pre-Twitter. I think that if people, like Chris suggests, the research shows that if tweeting sort of elevates your status as a scholar, I think that's going to leave some people out who are doing more controversial work or who are not yet tenured and are afraid to speak up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I really think we need to think about the incentive structures. I agree that engaging on social media is risky for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And at this point, we don't have a lot of incentive to do it apart from kind of trying to create our own kind of engagement. Universities and similar types of organizations will talk a good game about wanting to increase public engagement, but quantifying that is somewhat difficult. And I think a lot of people on appointment committees or tenure committees see social media engagement as somehow less impactful, when those of us who study this stuff, I mean, all three of us, know very well that this is where the lion's share of public engagement is happening. So really trying to think about transforming some of those incentive structures that would give all scholars, but particularly those who are underprivileged or maybe underemployed, another way to chart their impact.
I think the potential problem is, and I was just rewatching the Jonathan Haidt and Jonathan Rausch talk from earlier this month. And one of the things that Jonathan Rausch mentioned is there needs to be clear leadership on viewpoint diversity, and that we need someone at the top who's going to protect these young assistant professors and untenured professors. And I'm not sure that every university has that. In fact, I'm certain that they don't. Not all universities do have that. So I think that that institutional leadership is really essential as well.
So I'm going to play the other side. Some people will say, well, all of this talk about sort of fear of losing your job or fear of being canceled or whatever, whether it's left, right, whatever it's coming from, that it's a bunch of sort of overblown, it's a tempest in a teapot, and it's a bunch of overblown sort of hysterical responses. And so how do you think about that argument?
Chris, I'll let you take that.
Well, I think one thing we see in all aspects of social media is that, a small kind of usually more extreme or even angry group of people tend to get the lion's share of attention. And so, when we think about these kinds of dynamics, I think it's really important to think about whether, academia as it's depicted on Twitter is very different than academia in real life, as we all know, right? But if we think about, young scholars or students, undergraduates, graduate students, as they're trying to learn how universities work, Twitter is really filling that void. It's saying, well, here's how everything works, here's how you get published, here's what you should work on, and the amount of misinformation that gets shared in those conversations, I think, is really staggering. But in the context of people who are leading a kind of isolated career in the academy, right, doing research on their own primarily, these type of connections have a lot of impact, and I do worry that we pay a little bit too much attention to some of the most extreme arguments in this particular conversation. I
think that's very true, and I think that what you bring up is really important. That social media can serve as social support in what can be an isolating career. There's also this phenomenon, I don't know if you guys have seen this, people posting their shadow CV, which is like, if I were to say all the things that I had done even though I had a baby this year, or I had to move, or we had a pandemic, I've found that there's a certain level of authenticity and honesty among at least faculty in my related disciplines of communication and political science, who particularly younger faculty, who are willing to be like, look, this has been really hard, and sort of helping each other out and saying, look, I'm there I feel the same way, I'm there with you.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think we can do is to normalize failure. I mean, failure is part of science, right? It's an inevitable part of science. And another great example, in addition to that shadow CV, which I love too, was the CV of failures. It's several years ago. I think it was a social psychologist at Princeton, listed everything on his resume or CV that he didn't get, right? Every job he didn't get, every graduate school he didn't get into. And it went viral, and I think it was a great educational tool too. You know, if more of us did this, it would really help people understand.
I think you're absolutely right, because I think that, you know, every discipline is different, every grad school is different, but I think we can all agree that to some extent, as when you enter grad school, even particularly if you're a first generation graduate student, it's very intimidating, and we all deal with things like imposter syndrome. And I think that there's something really refreshing about these conversations that are happening online that are facilitating social support across faculty.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, no, it is interesting. And for the record, I was just channeling an argument. It's not necessarily something I agree with. So let me ask a different question. So it seems like I'm going to give you 3 problems that someone could argue are generated by social media related to knowledge production. And this is obviously not intended to be an exhaustive list. But one is pressure to do, this is, Lindsay, you sort of referred to this a little bit earlier, pressure to do a particular trendy research area that someone might not otherwise choose. 2 is concerned about saying something that runs afoul. This is more of the sort of cancellation concern, runs afoul of people and has repercussions, whether employment related, ostracization, whatever those repercussions look like. And then the other is sort of controlling, I guess relates to the first, controlling agenda setting. I guess those are very related, but how do you think about the relative importance of these concerns in terms of whether how concerned should people be, one over the other, or are there other things that are even more concerning that should be on that list?
I mean, I think it's dynamic. It's constantly changing. You know, Twitter, as an example, you know, when Twitter first came about, it was 140 characters, and people came up with really novel ways to use this medium that it was never intended for. Like, I don't know if you remember this, people would summarize novels in 140 characters, or they'd do recipes in 140 characters. So I think with any social media tool, and Chris can speak more to that people will make of it what they want to, so that the platform can be created with a certain idea in mind, but people will make of it what they want to. And I think that over time, I'm thinking of the fact that apparently Yik Yak is back. I don't know if that's just on my campus, but Yik Yak
that's the local thing, like where it's just
within, okay. I think it's within 3 miles.
Okay.
It's anonymous. And I asked my students what they thought about it, because the last time it was on campus, it was during a particularly sensitive period around race and police brutality. Mm-hmm. And I asked my students, are people talking about that? Or are they talking about other things? And they actually said, it's mostly people just trying to hook up. So, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that I think the way academics, the way students use these media shift and change over time. So I think you have to look at them as, it's not these particular concerns you bring up, I think may not be as much of an issue now, but I think as I think about them, and I think about how, you know, with studies like Chris mentioned, that maybe this becomes part of P&T document, and, you know, part of your social media score is just like your H index. So I think that those implications are a little bit concerning, but I think it's fascinating because it's a cultural product. It morphs and changes all the time. Chris?
Absolutely agree about that point about the purpose of the platforms. You know, you gave the example of Twitter, Lindsay, but we could say the same thing about Facebook, right? founded to help college undergraduates rate each other's physical attractiveness, or Instagram, originally a site to facilitate alcohol-centric gatherings, right?
I did not know that.
Who knows what started TikTok? But yeah. And when we think about it, then it makes perfect sense that it would kind of devolve into leaderless demagoguery, you know, like, and what I think we need is to kind of step back and say, you know, how could we design new environments, you know, that actually encourage and cultivate things like intellectual humility, you know, something I know you're really passionate about, Alana, and also Lindsay. You know, right now, it's hard to think about a social environment that would be less conducive to intellectual humility than social media, right? Admitting you were wrong, like you bravely did, Lindsay, and I've had to do before, not a pleasant experience, right? But imagine if that was somehow encouraged or rewarded through some type of status, or, you know, if you had, you know, status tied to, you know, successfully holding civil conversations, or persuading other people who don't share your views, or boosting content that, you know, resonates across social divides, and instead of, you know, the kind of preaching to the choir that we all kind of see. So, you know, I think it really cuts to the core. You know, like, are we going to be content to try to continually repurpose Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for these higher purposes? Because, well, like it or not, this is where our scholarly conversation is going, and much of our public conversation is going. Or do we try to create something new, maybe more localized to universities?
And I've been working on that, Chris, for years. I have a colleague in engineering, electrical and computer engineering, and we continue to put proposals together, NSF proposals, other grant proposals, to create something exactly like what you're talking about. And for the longest time, people on those committees would say, well, so the tool is basically something that would alert you to you're paying too much attention to liberal sources or conservative sources. Here's something from the other side, kind of thing, which now exists in multitude. There are several things that exist like this, but at the time, you know, 5-10 years ago, funding sources were like, well, who wants that? Nobody wants to be told that. And I think it's about, how do you make it a monetary success as well as a feel-good thing? And I think that's where I hope that there are some engineers on this call and in HXA, because I think if we as social scientists could connect with them, I think a lot of these issues could be addressed in the planning phases of these technologies, rather than retroactively evaluating what works and what doesn't. Because as in the case of Brianna Wu, in fact, I guest lectured an engineering class here at UD, where I showed the excerpt of that video from Brianna reading the tweets and messages she was sent. And 75% of it was bleeped because it was so profane. And I stopped there and I said, you know, as engineers, if you were working at Twitter, what could you have done before we released Twitter to help prevent that problem? And one of the first things that one of the engineering students said was, she should just go to a different platform. And I think that we need to have engineers working closely with social scientists and behavioral scientists to recognize these problems before they crop up, and to make user evaluation studies part of the criteria for getting these things out there.
That's interesting. Okay, so I'm going to switch to a different question here. So I'm going to make an argument here, and I first heard this argument written up by Kathy Young, but I don't know, she may not be the only person to have made it, but I'll just give credit where credit is due. So some people have argued that when it comes to attacks on academics, and I'm going to come around to the social media part of the question, the pattern is something as follows. When those attacks come from outside academia, they're usually from the political right. And when they come from inside academia, they're usually from the political left. So do you agree with that assessment? And how would you characterize the role of social media in those attacks, for lack of a better word?
Chris, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I don't know of any hard data. I've seen this argument. I think like it resonates with my experience, you know, anecdotally. I would love to see a little more data. I mean, we've seen a lot of asymmetry in polarization, for example. Whether it extends to this issue is probably part of a broader issue too, right? About kind of concern, especially on the right, about, trends in academia. And we've seen, so many schools, right up the street from me, UNC, for example, involved in this very public dispute, which, several former colleagues of mine, I used to teach there, are absolutely being harassed, almost hourly, by people who, they think are on the right. And this issue of whether the attacks from the left come from inside is interesting. There was this, I think, very provocative but thought-provoking essay in The Atlantic recently, likening cancel culture and academia on the left to kind of like a Salem witch trial kind of dynamic. I think that might be a little too strong an analogy, but the idea that there's this kind of collective bloodletting function does jive with some of the sociological analysis of how these things unfold. Again, maybe the analogy takes it too far, but thinking about thinking about academia as having these kind of self-policing dynamics, certainly that's something that I've experienced too.
Mm-hmm. No, it is interesting. I mean, I agree with you. It'd be fascinating to see sort of hard data on that. I would love to see that. I mean, it is one of those things where you read it and you're like, oh yeah, that kind of does make sense, but you just don't know if it's, confirmed on any scale.
At the same time though, I'll relate another anecdote. I feel like I'm just telling stories here, but maybe it's 7:30 over here on the East Coast. It's time to just start storytelling. But in 2016, we had Milo Yiannopoulos coming to campus. The Young Republicans invited him. And so I'm not sure, the argument was basically, there were administrators, there were faculty, there were students who were very much disagreeing about whether or not to permit this person to speak on campus. And of course, I came down on the side of permitting him to speak on campus because we don't want to shut down voices, because that's a slippery slope to shutting out other voices. But I was kind of surprised at the number of people at the university who were supportive of canceling that speaker. Maybe that is emblematic of the left. I'm not sure. Sometimes I think we pit the left and the right against each other. And when we look at the actual demographics, so many more people are somewhere in the middle. And so I think you're right in saying that most of the loudest speech comes from the far left and the far right. But I think one thing that I try to help my students to understand is that there are far more people that aren't speaking up and are in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can find ways to enable them to speak out more, whether they're academics or students or whomever, I think that's what we need, that right now more than ever.
Yeah, no, I think I think those are great points. So here's a question. So if you're not on social media, for those, I'm barely on social media and I can't be the only one. If you're not on social media, how much attention would you say that people need to pay to their online presence anyway?
Academics in particular?
Yeah, sure. You can interpret it however narrowly or widely as you'd like.
I think with the opportunity, this isn't social media per se, but I think with the opportunity of so many TEDx talks, I think if you don't necessarily want to be active on social media all the time and, wasting your time trying to figure out, here's another drawback, trying to figure out, what all the memes mean and what does this hashtag mean, and what's, trying to understand the culture, because it can be intimidating. I'm admittedly a TikTok lurker. I've never posted anything, but I've been on there for over a year and I'm still kind of like, what does this mean exactly? So I think that there's the concern about it takes time to figure out, especially for us old people, to figure out what the language is. But I do think that opportunities like TEDx talks, and a lot of universities have these now, that's a way to promote, if you have written a book or if you have a particular area of research that you like to highlight. I think that's a great way to get your voice out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Lindsay, I don't think anybody understands how TikTok works, so at least I don't either.
I'm somehow got on dog TikTok, and I'm very happy with that. Just I'm happy to see a happy dog, happy dog.
Yeah. I think that your question though, Alana, raises a broader point, which is like, you know, in this business, we're not taught how to do a lot of stuff. We're not taught how to teach. We're not taught how to mentor. You know, we're taught how to do research, and we're not taught how to engage with the public. And I think that's a huge gap. And you know, I would advocate for, you know, people and universities to hold workshops. You know, and some places are starting to do this already. But you know, there are really a lot of concrete pieces of advice that we can pass along. You know, like something as simple as, you know, would you share what you're about to share on social media with the entire world, right? Because a lot of people, I think, especially junior scholars, as they come on social media, you know, assume they've only got a few friends following them and interacting with them. All of a sudden, they find themselves in some kind of hot water, right? Or just learning how to engage with, you know, higher status accounts and enter conversations where there's a lot of public concern, and how to translate your work into those conversations. These aren't, you know, these aren't things we are taught. And I think they're things that certainly open up a lot of channels to the media and elsewhere. And I just think there's a lot of confusion about how to unlock those for people inside academia.
Well, and I think there's an interesting example. I was listening to the New York Times, The Daily, from this past Sunday, and I'm forgetting the guy's name, but he worked for Dominion Voting Systems. And do you guys listen to this one?
No, yeah, keep going.
It's really fascinating because he has become a target of the right, you know, fairly visible target. And he had, only because he had posted to his maybe 100, I think he had 140 friends on Facebook, and he posted some things that were, I don't know if I could say pro Antifa, but they were sort of supportive of Antifa efforts. And one of his friends, so this wasn't even a public page. This wasn't on Twitter. This wasn't elsewhere. This was a private page. And one of his friends, or somebody who knew his friend, screenshotted all those tweets, and it has led to a pretty difficult scenario for this gentleman.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to go to audience questions. This is also off script, so sorry. But here's the question. How, it seems like there's a question about whether and to what extent anyone, either inside or outside of academia, sort of looking at what's going on inside the academy, should draw conclusions based on someone's an instructor's social media persona about what they do in the classroom. Like, so how much do you think that's a warranted, like, in other words, should the default assumption be that someone's social media persona is actually a reflection on some level, greater or lesser, of what they do in the classroom, or that it shouldn't be? And how do you think about that link?
I'll try to answer this one. I mean, I try to keep things very separate in this domain. I try to think of the students who might not agree with me politically and kind of how they might react to this content, especially because our students and young people in general are on social media so much more than us. And even if we're sending out very subtle signals, liking things, you know, liking a takedown of the other side, or, you know, that can show up as we all know in your timeline. And so, you know, we're sending these subtle social signals to students who already feel, many of them, very, very scared of speaking out. So I think it's a responsibility for faculty. I'm sure reasonable minds will disagree, but that's my approach.
Well, I think, you know, just putting like viewpoints are my own in your bio or your description, we all know that, like, it's a priming effect. So if I'm following you and you are liking things and retweeting things that are very far left or very far right, that's what I'm going to think about you, even if it says in your description, this isn't regarding my teaching or my research. This is just my own, own opinion, doesn't represent my university, doesn't represent my teaching and research. I think that's kind of not a good way to demonstrate. So I take the same approach, which is I tweet and retweet things related to research. Mm-hmm. I tweet and retweet news, breaking news that I think is really interesting for my students to follow. And, funny stuff or just silly stuff or positive stuff, because I think that, and this is again why I really like TikTok so much, because it's just a silly place to be. It's just a fun, yes, people get political on there, particularly I remember around the January 6th events, there were a lot of people who were engaging in dialogue on TikTok about those events. But typically it's, what's the newest dance craze, or what's the cutest dog video? And there's something I think that we all need from that sometimes, like students, professors, everyone. I think that we don't need these social media platforms to constantly be places of debate and and argument and positioning.
Want the dog video. So it's interesting because for that question, I was actually thinking about it people looking in from the outside, and should they draw conclusions about, but you answered it. Your answer is actually collectively, it was more interesting in the sense that coming at it from the inside, saying that it's sort of a responsibility on the shoulders of instructors to recognize what that might look like to students and how they might respond. Yeah, I mean, I think those are
well, and I think in addition to students' parents. I mean, I think we all know that students' parents over time are just increasingly getting involved in their lives. And I'm sure both of you have had emails from parents that you're kind of like, okay, this person is an adult. But I think, why put yourself in a situation where people are going to question your integrity or your intention when I think all of us who are here, I mean, that's what I love about HXA is like, we're all here to say, we respect viewpoint diversity. And I think I, as a communication professor, I want to facilitate that. I don't want to be the person expressing all the views on either side, but I want to be supportive of those views.
Right. No, I appreciate the thoughtfulness. Okay, so I'm going to go to a couple of audience questions here. So one question is, how would you suggest young faculty or graduate students promote their work and connect with peers without using Twitter? And then the second part of that question is, we touched on a little bit, how can faculty successfully model effective social media strategies, especially for graduate or undergraduate students? So you can tackle either or both.
I'll tackle the first question. I think there are some, actually Chris would probably be better at this. He knows more about social media than I do, but I know there are some private apps that people can create communities within. And this can be a Google group or, a private Facebook group. I've also seen a number of younger scholars engaging in creating newsletters, particularly in political science. There's been a large movement of women political scientists sort of banding together who are kind of saying like, because historically political science has been very male dominated. And I think there are a lot of younger women who say, I want to hear from other younger women pre-tenure about the challenges that they're facing, whether they're parents, whether they're not parents, whether they live far from home. So I've seen a rise in these kind of like email newsletters, weekly newsletters that I think can be really empowering particularly for young women.
Yeah, I think those lateral connections are hugely important. When I was a young scholar, I was looking up to people, my heroes, big name professors. And what I didn't know at the time, and what I wish I know, is that the people to the left and the right of me were going to be my colleagues who created, some of the most enduring kind of relationships with at a scholarly level. And so thinking about ways to inculcate those, I think those private group ideas are a great idea, Lindsay, too. One thing I will say, though, is, I do worry a little bit about people, the smart, thoughtful, caring people all leaving the public platforms. We, this is an instinct that I think a lot of us who, are repulsed by incivility or concerned about the decline of civility on social media have thought about, right? Let's just all get off of this thing. I think the problem is, probably most of the people doing that are going to be the thoughtful, careful-minded people, and that might make the problem worse. And so I do want to kind of encourage people to share their work on social media, and there's ways to do it that don't necessarily cue in on politics. I think you made a good point earlier, Lindsay, that not everybody has that option if they're working on a very political subject. But simply saying, hey, I just published something, or hey, I just read this great article by so and so, I think those are all great ways to engage, and can even lead to productive outcomes for one's own path. Like maybe people recommending more research like the piece you liked, and that can generate really interesting conversations, and even a social media literature review from time to time, right, can happen. So that's a really useful way to use social media.
Right. No, I think those are great points. Okay, so let me go to another question here. There's a great difference between information, knowledge, and wisdom. Perhaps social media is about information, but not knowledge and wisdom. It's an interesting distinction. Could it ever be, and should we work toward that knowledge and wisdom, I assume, on social media?
That is a really fascinating question, and something that I think about a lot, because because I forget if this is Socrates or Plato, who argues that knowledge is a social construction. It happens with multiple people. It doesn't just come from one person. So the idea behind social media as being a consortium of many people, you would think that ideally it could be the creator of new knowledge. But I think that the norms around how people are using those social media, again, I'll go back to my example of when I tweeted something that was wrong. And by the way, I never deleted that because I'm like, okay, maybe someone else will find that useful. But the norms around that, around sort of just jumping on people and attacking them when they're wrong, rather than saying, how can we learn from this? And how can we maybe make this better? I think that that's problematic. I think that, so again, it comes back to the intention of the programmers and the engineers who create these platforms, and creating ways that people, like Chris mentioned, ways that people can get rewarded or get points for engaging across different matters. I've seen, as an educator, I've seen a lot of these types of tools introduced that are immersed in our course learning management systems. Like Yellow Dig is one. I don't know if you guys have had this on your campus, but it rewards people for engaging in dialogue. And so I think they are out there. I think at this point, most of the ones I've seen are more geared towards academic groups. One that I keep getting an email about is Packback. I haven't tried it out yet, but that's another one that I keep getting notifications about. But as it is, I think Chris is right that, there are going to be these dominating media platforms, social media platforms. There's going to be Twitter, there's going to be Facebook. And I think, I'm not sure if those are ever going to be because of those norms, I'm not sure those are ever going to be a great way to create knowledge. I think they're just going to be people shouting into the void.
Yeah, it's a great question. As I was reading the question, I was thinking, I haven't seen the word wisdom in social media in the same sentence ever before, I don't think, right? But I do think, sure, we'd like it to at least be about information, but I'm worried it might not even be that. So, I think that's what we'd all like social media to be, right? A place we go to get information in its purest, maybe ideal, typical form. It would be like a competition of ideas, right? Where every idea is free to compete based on its own merits. But that all assumes that the motivation of most social media users is to come on and get information. And I think, like, in some of our research in the polarization lab here at Duke, that's not kind of what we're seeing. That's what we'd love to see, but what we're really seeing is that it's really about identity development and status seeking. And so, when we start to think about the motivations of people, maybe among some of the people on this call, it's information and a small group of, highly motivated, politically informed people. But for most people, I worry that it's not that. And I think, that represents a core challenge, because we're going to core challenge to some popular ideas. For example, if we want everybody to get outside their echo chambers, well, for some people, that might mean exposing themselves to a broader range of views. For other people, it might be exposing them to more incivility and ad hominem attacks. So, we need to think really carefully about not just, the small circle of people who are heterodox, but, the much greater majority who's largely detached from these debates and what's motivating them to use social media. That's one concern I have about, queuing in on the information angle.
Right. No, those are real concerns. Okay. So Reddit, which hasn't specifically come up yet, is a strange space full of ugliness. I'm just reading the question. Is a strange space full of ugliness, but also deep knowledge, and it's largely homegrown. As we consider solutions, should we encourage the users to figure this out for themselves? In other words, to let them build the knowledge spaces that they prefer and follow the natural course of things as free from platform interference as possible. And the person is wondering what the panelists think about this.
I can try this one, Lindsay. I've done some research that might be relevant. So I agree that, Reddit for me is kind of simultaneously the best and the worst of social media. I think we've all seen some of the kind of reprehensible content that can emerge in especially kind of largely anonymous settings, but that same anonymity can also be a feature and not a bug. One of my favorite examples is the subreddit Change My View, where people kind of, state an unpopular opinion, and then they other Redditors kind of respond, and largely civil conversations, granted among a very small group of people who care to change their minds or who are looking to change other people's minds. But it raises this really interesting question about the affordances of different platforms. And I think Reddit, in addition to letting people generate their own spaces, and this is something we're starting to see some other platforms play with, especially Twitter with spaces and communities, but also anonymity has this feature where, perhaps in its best form, we can explore unpopular ideas outside the context of peer pressure. So if you lean to the right and you're questioning the evidence about voter fraud, Reddit's a great place to talk about that, but Twitter is a terrible place to talk about that, because you'll not only get it from the other side, but your own side too. So, anonymity does have this kind of, it's a double-edged sword.
Well, I'm thinking back to Jonathan Rauch's talk too about his book, The Constitution of Knowledge. And I think we need a constitution for these different platforms. We need to have sort of rules of engagement. And I mean, if you think about any sort of civil discourse intervention, we're doing a lot of stuff around civil discourse on our campus this year. You need facilitators. You need people to help you understand how to have these conversations. I don't think you can leave it up to the people to figure that out for themselves. So I think actually Wikipedia is kind of my preferred model here, because we have a community of people who have been sort of entrusted with being responsible for editing the content, for looking out for people who are messing with the content. And, if we talk about, how do you develop knowledge, Wikipedia is a great example of that. And really, it's kind of the only remnant of sort of the early days of the internet doesn't have advertising, that is completely open to anyone who wants to engage. So I think the norms, the constitution, if you will, around Reddit, I don't think facilitate that kind of conversation, except for maybe the subreddit Change My View. But I think that Wikipedia demonstrates that something like that can be possible if the sort of the goals and the mission of the page or the app or whatever it is are clear, and that people who are coming on there, kind of like you said with Change My View, they're coming in there to agreeing to be like, okay, we're going to have a civil conversation here. But if you're going to go to the subreddit, Trump won or whatever it is, like that's not a place where you're going to probably have a constructive conversation. So I think the important thing here is we need to help equip people, and from a communication perspective, we need to help equip people with the tools and the skills they need to disagree without being disagreeable, to be able to listen and engage in active listening. And how do you replicate that online? Like, that's kind of hard to do. All the work that I'm doing on my campus, it's about in-person interactions, because nonverbals matter. And, all these things matter, and engaging with conversations about difficult topics, like my conversation today about sexual assault in our classroom. I couldn't have had that conversation in any kind of online forum, I think, effectively. So I think we have to sort of recognize the limits, and maybe there's one benefit of the pandemic is my students don't want to be on their computers or their phones anymore. They actually want to engage in person, because they were so sick of being on their phones and computers. So maybe who knows, we'll see a resurgence in like, let's just get together and talk like we used to.
But I actually think that you talk about sort of rules of engagement or something like that, but you have to, in the problems of online versus in person, and that which is, at least in theory, solvable in the long term and somewhat solvable in the short term. You can't even, it seems to me that you can't even get to the point where you're talking about rules unless you agree on the goal.
Right.
And so, right. And it always comes back to this, nobody says that they're against free speech, or like, I would like less civil discourse. I mean, nobody says this. And so nobody articulates their position that way. But it's a question of sort of do we even agree on, you know, on these issues where the rubber meets the road or whatever, do we agree on what the goal is, which is that, you know, when these things come into conflict, sometimes you're going to have to prioritize, you know, whatever, sort of the conversation over people's feelings or something like that. And that's where it really gets rough, and sort of without I guess my thought is that without an agreement about the goal, I'm not sure the rules matter, but.
And that's where I come back to the importance of, before these technologies and websites are developed, engaging with social and behavioral scientists. And I'm just not seeing that. I'm not seeing that that technology companies and engineers are prioritizing that. And I wish that's the cultural change I would like to see.
Just getting back to Reddit for a moment, there's a really interesting experiment where basically a code of values was randomly distributed to different subreddits.
Can you post that in the comments if you have a second?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And
chat.
Sure enough, you know, what the author found, J. Nathan Matthias, is that, you know, norms are contagious. You know, once you kind of set that stage, people tend to act more civilly. And on the other side of the continuum, there's some really interesting research that shows just how easy it is to induce trolling, you know. So Yuri Leskovich's work shows that, you know, just exposing people to one uncivil comment in a newspaper article in a small kind of online experiment increases the probability that they will say something trolly or uncivil by quite a lot. So it really does seem to be, we just need reminders about what the purpose is.
Right.
And, you know, in the communication literature, there's similar research from University of Wisconsin-Madison from Dominique Broussard and Dietram Scheufele, where they identified the nasty effect, where even in an article that wasn't about anything political, it was about nanotechnology, if there were negative comments in this experiment, people were much more likely to view nanotechnology more negatively. So I think it's important for us to sometimes, I'm kind of repeating myself, is to sort of step out of the political realm sometimes, even though that's my focus, is that in understanding that this could impact not just perceptions of President Biden or you know, a policy, but it could impact just our even our understandings of what's real. You know, QAnon, I think, is a good example of how there are things that are in the QAnon, what would you call it, package of beliefs that are kind of like so deterrent from any political values or beliefs that you're kind of like, how did that get, like, there was this video circulating, I think I saw it on TikTok, of a guy, a parent in, I'm forgetting what town, but it was at a school board meeting, where he stood up and said, if you believe that children should be wearing masks, then you also believe in childhood sex trafficking. Like, he said that because you're covering their faces, you are making them anonymous and more likely to be sex trafficked. And so I think sometimes these things aren't necessarily political, but people can hold on to these things really dearly. And it's when, you know, again, we always talk about confirmation bias and about in-group, out-group stuff. The longer we have people just communicating within these very small echo chambers, this is just going to get worse. So again, I call on the engineers and the software developers to think about these things and think about ways that, you know, we will always be human. We will always be tribal. We will always be, as Jonathan Haidt put it, 90% chimp and 10% bee. How can we find ways to flip that hive switch to be more engaged with each other and connected with each other? And particularly, how can we do that online? Because I think that's much harder to do if you aren't physically with other people. Thank you for sharing those.
Yeah, we've got some great links in the chat. Okay, so another question. This question references, so Lindsay talked about the expectation that young people have for, and we talked a little bit about this in our earlier, for immediate responses to certain events, I think at the beginning. In contrast, Jonathan Rauch has argued that liberal science and government operate slowly on purpose in order to arrest rash decision-making by passionate, sometimes flawed people. How do you think this tension can be resolved? Sort of the need to slow down to, I mean, I read that question as the need to slow down to sort of prevent the rash decision-making, and the desire for, we need this immediate response.
Well, I'll tell you exactly what my student said today, because one of the students in my class is actually the vice president for the internal fraternity organization. I forget what it's called. I'm sorry. But he has had to deal with this issue very directly, because the student who was suspended was a fraternity member. And so they have had to act really, really fast. And one of the things that my students told me is that they didn't need a full statement right away from the university. What they wanted was, we know that this happened, we care about you, and we're working on putting together a statement. And I think sometimes it isn't a great idea to put something out immediately, because it could come off as tone deaf, which I would argue was the case in a previous example that I won't talk too much about, but that the students reacted very negatively. I would argue that just saying like, look, hey, we know this happened. We care about you. We care about the university community. We're working on a statement to address these issues. If you have comments or questions or concerns, here's a place to send them. I think they don't like, again, this is a small sample of my classroom with around a specific incident, but I think they didn't like, the other thing I'll mention that I thought was interesting is they didn't like that this letter came from our vice president for student affairs and our chief diversity officer rather than the president. And they made it very clear that the president is a symbol, a monarch, one put it, like you want to hear it come from the top. And so I think that's a good lesson to learn from this. And I am hoping to do some research around this, since our campus is so engaged in these topics right now. I've already I've already applied for an IRB protocol to get approved to do some research around this stuff. So I think sometimes your own campus can be the best laboratory.
Thoughts, Chris?
Well, I think just slowing things down. I mean, we have a lot of evidence now that slowing things down can be helpful. I agree, making students feel heard is paramount, but also, trying to de-escalate a little bit. I think Twitter's, experiment with friction, kind of slowing down the rate of sharing. Facebook whistleblower mentioned this in her testimony the other day too, suggesting it could slow down, some of the more volatile debates on Facebook. And it's really too bad, because although we all know that asynchronous nature of debate can cause problems, right? The context collapse, people might, not appreciate where people are coming from, and so on and so forth. It also, in theory, can give us more time to carefully consider, other views. And I think, that is maybe a net positive, like an in-person conversation or a debate at a university is going to last an hour and a half. But a Twitter conversation could go on for weeks, and sometimes for the better.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, the other thing just seems to be that, I don't even know where this fits in, but it just seems that there are so many incidents where the sort of facts that you think, whatever you think the facts are, whatever the thing is first happens, turns out to be a lot different, a week later or 2 weeks later, or no, I'm not saying you can necessarily wait that long in all cases, but it just, the information itself changes. Okay, we have one more question from the audience and then we're going to wrap up. So the last question is, does the way social media allows research to spread so quickly, is it implicitly a critique of the process of traditional research dissemination in academia?
I think that's a really fascinating point, because we all know that the publishing process is very, very slow, and particularly in our areas of research around social media and these kinds of things, they're changing all the time. And so what's the value of taking something to a conference, getting it evaluated, taking it to a publication, getting it rejected, taking it to another publication, getting it rejected, taking it to another publication, getting it possibly revised and resubmit, and then taking the months to revise and resubmit it. Is that process ideal when we're researching things that are moving very, very quickly? At the same time, a researcher risks not getting published if they post something that's unpublished up on Twitter, and it turns out now reviewers can identify who they are, so it's no longer a blind review process. So I'm not sure I have an answer to it. I think that there's a real tension there. I think that as academics, I think just like, what I was saying with the university system in general, in terms of more faculty becoming administrators and more adjuncts and things moving into the teaching ranks, I think we have a lot of questions to ask ourselves in academia about whether some of these models still work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I see so many positives about open science and sharing work publicly, but I also do agree there's some negatives. I feel like I'm the serial link sharer tonight, but it is another really interesting study that looked at kind of the pace of scientific progress, and basically what it finds is when we rush to conclusions, there's a crowding effect, and we all rush around those those kind of sexy conclusions. And then, all the really ultimately important science kind of gets left by the wayside. So this kind of trendiness could be really bad for science, I worry. It could create some perverse incentives. And then also watching the way these things trickle into the media. I mean, it's been pretty surprising to me how many, for example, New York Times op-eds or major New York Times pieces have been dissecting a single working paper, that hasn't even been presented at a conference yet, much less peer reviewed. And, presenting it as kind of authoritative, and we saw a lot of examples throughout COVID too of research that came out very quickly and was debunked. So I agree, speed is great and we need speed, and openness is great for those who can afford to do it. But there are some downsides.
Right.
Could I jump back to the previous question really quickly? Because one of the things that came up in the class today was sort of, what are some other ways the university could have responded to a crisis like this? Mm-hmm. And 6 years ago, we had a racial incident on campus where a student found actually what he thought was a noose hanging from a tree on our campus. You can look that up if you want to know the details about whatever happened with that. But our president, that was about like midnight. By the next day at 3 p.m., there was a platform set up on our main green with a lectern and a microphone. And the then acting president allowed students to just come up and share their experiences on the microphone. And they felt empowered and they felt heard. And so sometimes it might not be that the president needs to make a statement, in an email within 24 hours, but that the president shows up on campus and says, I care about these issues too, and I want to hear from you. Mm-hmm. And I think that can actually be a more effective response.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Well, I want to thank our panelists for sharing such rich insights, and to everyone who has been in attendance for taking the time to join us tonight. I want to share just a couple of announcements before we wrap up. So we hope you'll join us for Heterodox Academy's next webinar event, which is called Overcoming Academic, I think Kyle said this at the beginning, Overcoming Academic Pressure with Intellectual Character, which will be on Tuesday, November 9th. And the panelists will explore how curiosity, humility, empathy, and more can mitigate academic stress and affect cultural change. Second, if you're not yet a member or a friend of Heterodox Academy, we invite you to become a part of our network. You can visit heterodoxacademy.org/join to learn more. Additional information about these opportunities will be shared in a post-event email. And I just want to thank everybody again for joining us tonight. Thanks to our panelists and to the audience, and hope to see you soon.